This episode of the Beta Files, I was originally going to do a thing on masculinity and kind of give a Gen Xer take on masculinity, but I'm going to push that off to the next episode, so it'll be episode 3 that we do that one, because a lot of really crazy stuff has happened this week in the media, and so I decided kind of at the last second, you know what, let's do an ongoing series on the national media and how the national media is basically creating this dividing line among us as a culture. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. This will be the first part of, like I said, a multi-part series, probably an ongoing series, because they just don't stop. They keep going, and they keep doing crazy things. So we're going to call it the Hate Machine. So today on the Beta Files, part 1 of the Hate Machine. Hang on to your diapers, babies. I'm the barber. This is the Beta Files. All right, to give you an idea of what all happened this week, it actually started a couple weeks ago, right around the time. Sorry, I had to tighten that up. Right around the time of the Tom Cotton op-ed in the New York Times. And since then, since that particular cultural moment where the New York Times, if you're not familiar with the story, they ran a op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton, which was very inflammatory. It was about getting the troops in to kind of quell the protests and the riots. There's a lot of incendiary language in it, and the New York Times kind of just let it go, and there was very little editorial oversight, and of course it blew up in their face. And there's multiple questions about that. How much editorial process should the New York Times have in op-eds, and then on top of that, how do they deal with an op-ed that kind of goes against the grain of the mainstream or the front page? And then, of course, could they have reacted differently once the op-ed was put out there? So all kinds of different questions have been raised. Did they do the right thing by forcing the editor to step down? Did they do the right thing in calling out and throwing out this young staffer who kind of gave the green light before the editor gave the green light, by throwing that kid under the bus? And then eventually, I'm sure he's probably gone too. I honestly don't know enough of his part of the story. But that's the beginning. And then over the past several weeks, numerous other publications have been very non-lenient towards editors, towards reporters, towards anyone who's going against the liberal, and this is a liberal news story, the liberal leaning narrative of supporting Black Lives Matter and supporting the protests and covering the protest. Okay. And it kind of came to a head this week. At least I hope it came to a head, because it was what happened this week in the press just stirred up a firestorm among journalists. So you have a dividing line between, not just between the conservative and liberal journalists, but now within liberal journalism itself, you have a dividing line. And the point where it kind of came to a head was this young reporter this reporter by the name of Lee Fang with the publication The Intercept. And what had happened was Mr. Fang had interviewed a black activist who, in the interview, was quoted as saying, and I'm going to paraphrase, but was quoted as saying, it's great that we're getting attention about black on white or white on black murders. When are they going to talk about black on black crime? And of course, he was alluding to the problem of gentrification and the inner city, continued inner city problems that they have. Now, this is a black activist that Lee Fang was quoting. And one of his colleagues, a white liberal woman, called Mr. Fang a racist and said that he was going against what he had been told he could and could not report on. He's not reporting on anything. He just posted it to his social media to kind of get a conversation going. This is the point of the press. We have to talk. There are conversations that need to be had. It's not just about police brutality on black lives. If we're going to talk about systemic racism, we have to talk about all of the implications of systemic racism. We have to talk about all of it. You cannot just pick and choose. And that's what Lee Fang and his quote from the black activist was pointing to, was this idea of we have to talk about multiple pieces of this. We can't just focus in on a couple. Now, keep in mind, well, we'll come back to that, because one of the things that we're going to talk about is something that Mike Tiabbi wrote about last year. In fact, most of the material we're going to reference today comes from Mike Tiabbi, or not Mike Tiabbi. I'm sorry, Matt Taibbi. I knew I was going to say Mike Tiabbi. Mike Tiabbi is a sports guy. Matt Taibbi is not. But anyway, so Matt Taibbi, who is a reporter largely known for his work with Rolling Stone, he has written a couple of articles. One he wrote last July, which we're going to reference in the second half of this episode, and then the other article he wrote a couple days ago, which is how I found out about the whole Lee Fang debacle. He had gone on Rising with Crystal and Sagar, and I just happened to catch the YouTube clip of his interview, and that's how this fell across my radar, like I said. And then the very next day, the NBC Google story broke. And we'll talk about that here in just a second, too. But anyway, going back to this Lee Fang story, Fang ended up having to craft a public apology not for the quote, but for a couple of things that he had said on Twitter. At least this is my understanding. A couple of things that he had said on Twitter in response to his colleagues coming after him in the social media sphere for posting the quote from the activist that he had talked to. What ended up happening, he still has his job, but he was threatened, and he ended up making amends with the young lady who originally called him out. But what ended up happening was it showed the true nature of left-leaning media. Okay? Now, there is this there's this myth in our culture that liberal media controls the news cycle. To some extent, it is true, and to some extent, it is not. To the extent that it's true, there is an overwhelming presence of liberal media, of liberal media publications compared to conservative media publications. For every Wall Street Journal, you have Bloomberg, New York Times economy section, the Washington Post business section, The Economist, which I would say the Economist is probably right-leaning. But you get the idea. It's not, and what we're talking about is business section. It's rarely that the Wall Street Journal makes the news and making some huge cultural push. It's mostly economics. And so the right gets, tagged with the idea of fiscal economics. But you understand there's not as much, which we're going to talk about the Federalist, which is part of the Wall Street Journal, from what I understand. But you get the idea. There's not a lot of right-leaning, compared to left-leaning publications. There's not a lot of right-leaning publications to kind of balance it. So to a certain extent, you could make the argument from certain angles that the liberal media does control the news cycle. But I think in today's world, social media drives the news cycle more than a liberal or conservative media presence. And I'll clarify that argument because most of the things that are happening on social media at this very moment are being driven by the liberals. But when we look at it, liberal media is now reacting to social media. And there are characters out there, there are malefactors on both the liberal and conservative sides that purposely plant stories on social media to get the news cycle going or to get it into the news cycle of what's happening. But I think for the most part, social media is more in the driver's seat than something like a national conglomerate of liberal, left-leaning media publications. But what the Lee Fang incident ended up doing was exposing the erratic nature, I guess you would say, of the liberal-leaning institution, the New York Times and Washington Posts and those newspapers. And it kind of saddens me a little bit because I'm a subscriber to both the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Atlantic. So my national media consumption is mostly liberal-leaning, left-leaning publications, and I am an avid listener of NPR. However, I'll go ahead and tell you right now, and I think I mentioned this in one of the other things that we've done for the website. I'm a moderate. I register independent, and I'm a moderate in the fact that I refuse politically to declare myself left or right, because for me there's a lot of valid points that both sides can make, and understanding where they are in this country, geographically and socially, has a lot to do with the validity of their arguments. You can, and I've said this for years, a kid from the Bronx is experiencing a completely different world from a kid who lives in Nebraska. And both of them are experiencing a completely different world from a kid in South Central, right? Or Seattle, or Columbia, South Carolina, or Tallahassee, Florida. They each one, depending on where you're at in this country, you experience life in a completely different way from other people in other parts of the country. It's just a fact of life. Okay? You react to your environment differently because the environment itself is different. If you are, we always laugh at my uncle who lives in Orlando, Florida. He actually lives in Winter Park. And it gets to 60, 61 degrees down there, and he's wearing a coat. And we live in North Carolina where 60, 61 is mild, right? But then we get down up here in North Carolina, we get down into the 40s, and we're cold. And I have relatives in Pennsylvania, and tell them, gosh, it's cold down here. It's in the 40s. And they're like, that's not cold. So depending on, even environment plays a huge factor in who you are. And so this idea that we have a sameness across the board is just kind of ludicrous. And I really forgot where I was going with that, but I could tell you, just looking at the Lee Fang thing, it exposed a problem with liberal, with the liberal media institutions, and how ridiculous it's gotten since the George Floyd murder as far as their coverage. And I have been saying since the first week of this whole thing, and I've said it at least twice in again, 2 different things that I've done for the YouTube channel. Be careful of what you hear from the national media. Both sides. Be very careful. It was weird because in one of I think it was BetaFiles episode 3, the YouTube BetaFiles on episode 3, the one where we had the script. I had used Tucker Carlson and Rich Eisen to show 2 different points of view of the same thing, that we were very frustrated. After the first week, we as a culture and as a nation were just extremely frustrated. And I have been following Tucker Carlson, his career, since the Crossfire incident with Jon Stewart. That was the first time I was exposed to Tucker Carlson. And I watched him in between the CNN and MSNBC years, and then the MSNBC years, and now the Fox News years. I've kept track of him. I'm not a big fan of Tucker. Don't think, oh God, he's a banner carrier for Tucker. But it's fascinating to follow somebody's career and watch the ups and downs and watch how they react to different things. So Tucker has this monologue of just frustration with open frustration with our leadership. And he took a few cuts at the administration and Donald Trump himself. And so that's the piece that I pulled from when I was giving an example of the frustrations that we have as a culture. And then I countered that with Rich Eisen, a sportscaster, who on his podcast show did the same thing. He really just lashed out at the leadership of this country. And so I was like, okay, thank you, Tucker, for doing something. And then a week later, he's right back to doing what he always does, and that is just expressing his thoughts and opinions, which immediately isolate. One of the things that I just get so frustrated with over the left-leaning media is every time he does something like this, they megaphone it by digging into it and going after him. And it's just like, when are you going to learn that he'll stop or he'll back off doing a lot of this stuff when you stop putting him on the front page every time he purposely says something he knows is going to put him on the front page of the Washington Post and the New York Times. Why? It doesn't make any stop. Take his power away by ignoring him. You don't have to cover every stupid thing that Tucker Carlson says. You just don't have to. And that's probably why I'm fascinated with watching his career, is not necessarily him, it's how they react to him, because it's hilarious. He can get their panties in such a tight wad, and they go after it every time. They take it hook, line, and sinker every time. And they still haven't figured it out yet. That he's baiting them, right? He does it on purpose. Hannity does it because Hannity is trying to rile up his base. Tucker, for the most part, if you actually pay attention and watch the not necessarily watch Tucker Carlson on a regular basis, you would get so angry and so frustrated. But watch the patterns. Tucker, it gets quiet. Tucker hadn't done anything in a while, and all of a sudden he's front page news, and he'll be front page news for a couple weeks, because once he gets on there, he'll keep it up. He knows that he's got him, and then he'll back off and change gears, or something will happen, and he'll let the focus shift away from him. He does this constantly. He's been doing this, like I said, he's been doing this. He's been doing it since he was on MSNBC. So this is not new. He's gotten more frequent with it since he's gotten to Fox. I will tell you that. Because I'm sure at MSNBC they probably cracked down on him quite a bit. You can't do that. So anyway, but just like I said, it's fascinating to follow him. Laura Ingraham, we won't even get into her. So anyway, or Matt Al. So. All right, so this Lee Fang guy. So I keep saying this, and I keep getting sidetracked. But it exposes this rift on how ridiculous the left-leaning established media will go. And that the thing is, we saw this with Russiagate, what they're calling Russiagate. We saw it with the Ukrainian thing. Excuse me. But I think it wasn't as obvious for the American public, basically because you had Congress interacting at the same time. Whereas with this, they're kind of doing this on their own. They're making the rules on their own, and again, they're feeding off what they're seeing on social media. The problem is, and I talked about this in the Now See This Here Now Then episode on Facebook. The way the algorithms are built, these social media platforms are only going to show you people who think the same way you do, and they're going to show you the articles that match what you're saying and what you've read. They're built to keep you in a silo and keep you separated from everybody else. It's a fault of the algorithm. And, I don't know Mark Zuckerberg's morals. I don't know Jack Dorsey's morals, or the YouTube morals, the guys at the top of YouTube. I don't know their morals. I don't know any of them's morals. Maybe they are like these evil, Dr. Evil style characters that sit there with their bald cats and putting their pinkies to their mouths. Maybe they are. I don't think they are. I think they're a greedy bunch of millennials that happen to fall into a really good idea, and they didn't think ahead to what the implications would be, and now they're in the thick of it. That's what I think. Because you look at the algorithm, just for example, the Facebook algorithm. So it is built to establish and build communities. That was the pitch. And you can see the argument there. You can see the honest justification of building the algorithm to kind of promote this idea of, look, you can talk to people that you enjoy talking to. The negative of that unfortunately, and with this national media, which we're going to talk about here in just a second, with Taibbi's 10 Rules of Hate, the media, just because they're feeding off social media, they kind of reinforce this idea that, no, your camp is base camp for the war. So your little group of friends, you're in the foxhole together. And everybody else outside that foxhole is the enemy. And so instead of promoting this idea of shared community the way the algorithm was originally pitched, and the original intentions behind it, it has become, through this process of decommunitizing, I guess you would say, of splitting everybody, of cutting everything down the middle. Through that process, it's become the nasty viral thing that it is. The cesspools, right? And I think that's kind of Instagram is it is an odd player in all of this. And then the YouTube algorithm, although it caters to your personal tastes, you can change those tastes rather quickly. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So I was looking towards, looking for ideas on what to do with the podcast itself, on not just necessarily structure of the content, but also what to do with it as far as publication, as far as getting my name out there, getting the podcast name out there, that kind of thing. So basically advertising, marketing, that kind of thing. And there's some really great guys out there that have just full YouTube channels on trying to give you good ideas on the podcast versus a YouTube channel. And so there was this one guy, I think his name is Pat something. But he has the passive passive finance channel. But I watched one of his videos, just one. And the next day there's another one of his videos in my suggestions. So I watched that one. And then the next day, the third day, I get up, there's another video by Pat in my suggestions. And these are not brand new videos. A lot of these were tailored around the content, shared content of the original video that I had watched. And so just within 3 days, YouTube's algorithm had figured out that I wanted to see this guy. Has nothing to do with any of the other content I've ever looked at. But the algorithm figured it out. So I think the YouTube algorithm kind of does what was originally intended for the Facebook algorithm. But at the same time, if, let's say, somebody had mentioned, hey, you got to check out this really crazy conspiracy theory, right? Check out this YouTube video. So I go to that YouTube video. Well, now the next day I'm going to have another stupid conspiracy theory video in my suggestions. I'm like, oh my God. And it'll keep hitting until I click it, and eventually it'll go away because the algorithm will learn, okay, that was a one-off. But it usually takes a couple days to a week for the algorithm to catch up to that, or catch that's not my taste, right? When you do like this offhand video that you would never actually go looking for, but somebody had mentioned it to you. So it's, and I'm hoping that that's what happens in my videos. But so they keep showing up in people's feeds. So anyway, so going back to this, I've completely gotten off track and I am so sorry. All right, so let's go back to this. Tiabbi ended up, because of all this, Tiabbi wrote an article called "The American Press is Destroying Itself," and he hosted it himself. This is not something you're going to find on Rolling Stone or the Washington Spectator or any of the other publications that he writes for. He hosted it himself. I will have a link to the article in the description. In fact, I'll have a link to both of his articles in the descriptions and a link to his book, which I didn't even know existed until a couple days ago, and it should be here tomorrow. So I'm going to read that and probably talk about that in one of the other episodes in this series, in the Hate Machine series. I really like that, Hate Machine. But it all kind of, this whole thing just reeks of 1984 and the morning hate. If you don't know what I'm talking about, if you read 1984, there's a moment towards the beginning where they bring everybody into this room, and there's this huge television on the wall, and they sit everybody down, and they just start showing all these negative images of different things that are bad for the nation, that are bad for Big Brother and its programming, right? And they sit there, I think, for a half hour, or maybe 9 minutes. I can't remember the exact time. It's been so long since I've read 1984. But it's called The Morning Hate, and it's just basically brainwashing. And so when we look at the national media, that's what they do. They do it on a daily basis. It's just constant, nonstop. And Tiabbi kind of points to that in the other article we're going to talk about. But the American press is destroying itself. That article goes over not just the Fang incident, but also the incident at the New York Times. He also talks about Variety. Variety, if you didn't know, in the last 2 weeks has fired their editor, or else she has stepped down, put it that way, over the fact that she had not made the newsroom diverse enough. And it kind of leads to the question is, well, what do you mean by diverse? You know, are you talking about hiring people of different ethnicities? Are you talking about diversifying the content? In other words, not just letting minority voices in on the share of articles that are being put in Variety, but also talking about concerns that minority groups have. Because you can have a room full of minorities writing about, take sports, okay, Major League Baseball. But we'll say it's a baseball magazine, so it's supposed to be covering all aspects of baseball, and you have an entire room that is equally diverse among cultures, okay, and race. And all you focus on are the white players. And you make them write about the white players, nobody else. So in that case, you can have diversity without being diverse. And I think that's one of the biggest criticisms with this current, constant politically correct movement that the liberal part of our country is so married to, the cancel culture, which is basically what it is. It has stripped diversity from being diverse. You have all the promise of diversity by representation, increasing representation by minor communities within the nation, but you're limiting the diversity of the content by not allowing anything outside of your dogmatic view be presented to the public. And Taibbi kind of points that out in his most recent article. And he points it out in both these articles. But he notes in The Press is Destroying Itself that it's the left-leaning media that has drawn such a clear, distinct line and built this box that that they've trapped themselves in. That the right, they're feeding the right leading media just all kinds of great stories, because now the right can honestly sit back and say, hey, look at this. They've lost their minds. Because they have become so ingrained in this cancel culture mentality that at a moment in our history where the conversation can finally be had, they're derailing it. Not purposely, but they're derailing it because of their lack of empathy for the other side of the conversation, hearing the other voices. They will only allow specific voices in. And because of that, the media has just kind of collapsed, the national media. And you can make the argument that the right-leaning media had lost its mind a couple years ago, because it had, and it kind of fell apart, and now we're seeing the left fall apart too. Which may be a good thing. Maybe we're getting to the end of this ridiculous narrative that the media has put out since, the late 90s. Actually, it goes back further than that, but it really started to take hold in the late 90s when the neocons took over. Where we see this very sharp division and the national media. It's a product of the Fox effect. This idea that, you show your side. And we'll talk about that more here in just a second. I promise. I'm going to get to the other one. So anyway, everything culminates with the Google thing, which is absolutely hilarious. So Tuesday. I think it was Tuesday. Maybe it was Wednesday. No, it was Tuesday. Hold on. Okay. So, there's a great article on The Week by Matthew Walther, I think is his name. It's called The Real Google Scandal. And basically, it was Tuesday. Basically, he breaks down what happened. So, NBC News has this thing called a verification unit. And apparently what it was originally intended to do was kind of just go through and verify sources for NBC News to make sure that they were legit. What has happened is this verification unit has kind of become this vigilante police squad of NBC employees who are going through right-leaning publications and news sites and looking for possible ways that the site has done something egregious. So they zeroed in on two sites, Zero Hedge and the Federalist. And like any good tattletale, they called Google. And they told Google that Zero Hedge and the Federalist had violated Google's terms of service for paid content. When Google looked into it, they did see that Zero Hedge had, in fact, violated terms, but that the Federalist had not. But due to the nature of the material, the Federalist was put on warning by Google that if you want to continue to monetize, you're going to have to go in and clean this up. And the Federalists agreed. Okay. Now, I hope you're sitting down, because I'm going to tell you where this egregious material was on the Federalist website. When you go to any newspaper site or any journal site, in the articles at the bottom, there's this wonderful thing called the comment section. And in the comment section is where people kind of do a impromptu letter to the editor about the article. Now, 15 years ago, the comment sections were, because they were new, 20 years ago. Because they were new, you could actually have some decent conversations with people from all over the country and all over the world, in some cases, about certain articles and certain things that you found on blog sites and that kind of thing. But, God bless them, cancel culture happened. And with that, all the vitriol that you see on Twitter, well, the reason for that is because they had all kinds of practice in the comment section of articles on national media platforms. Now, some of the larger institutions instituted rules for their comment section. If you violate those rules, they take your comments down. And if you have multiple offenses, they'll end up blocking you from being able to comment on their articles. So some of them buckled down on it. Well, the Federalist had not. They left it open. I guess one of the things, and I really haven't read into why the Federalists left their comment section open, but I will probably having to do with the idea of a free and open debate. Which, if you look at the Federalist, just the Federalist papers, right? It's a lot of it argues free and open debate. That's how government advances. That's how society advances when you have a free and open debate. But this is 2020 in America, and there's no debating anymore. It's just, you're wrong, I'm right, you suck. Die. And that's what we see in these comments. And one of the comments that that NBC flagged for Google, it's so ridiculous, was a racist comment that had been left on the Federalist comment site. So here's the thing. NBC went into the Federalist's comment section of an article and flagged it for Google. On top of that, after they had done this, after they had contacted Google, NBC then reported that Google was pulling the funding or pulling the monetization rights for the Federalist. And then Google and the Federalist both responded with, no. Google and the Federalist, no. That hasn't happened. So NBC kind of found themselves in a bad spot. And ironically, I was watching, and there may be another clip out there that I maybe missed, but I had watched clips from Fallon and from Seth Meyers this morning to see if they've said anything. And of course, for some reason, they haven't spoken of it. Way to go, NBC News. So all that happened this week. It just shows, again, just this brazen, just ugly attempt by these larger liberal media chains to force a narrative. To force a narrative that only they agree with. And that if you are not a part of that narrative, then then we will, excise you. So a year ago, in July of 2019, Matt Taibbi actually addressed this actual phenomena, writing an article in the Washington Spectator called "The Media's 10 Rules of Hate." Now, this was actually based partially on some of the stuff from his book. His book is called Hate Incorporated. And like I said, I'll put a link for it on Amazon so you can go and at least get the ISBN. You don't have to necessarily buy it from Amazon, but you can grab the ISBN and go to Barnes & Noble or your local bookstore and see if they've got it. But I'll put that up in the description, as well as links to these two articles. But in The Media's 10 Rules of Hate, he basically lays out what he calls the check boxes for the national media. And you can see both of them doing this. And when I say both of them, the left and the right, they both do this. Okay? And Roger Ailes had a lot to do with most of the stuff on this list. So when we talk about the Fox effect, and actually next time, not in the next episode, episode 3, we're going to talk about masculinity, but in episode 4, we're coming back to this, because I had originally planned on doing an episode on how the media has changed since the 1980s, since the birth of CNN, basically, and how it has kind of evolved, and looking at it that way. So I'm actually going to incorporate that into this new series that I just decided to start yesterday. So it'll be part of the Hate Machine. It's just so cool. It's got a great ring to it. The Hate Machine. So anyway, I know I've already said that earlier. So the Media's 10 Rules of Hate, and again, this was published in the Washington Spectator last year, where Matt Taibbi kind of lays out the 10 things that all of these guys, the 3 cable news channels, the major media outlets as far as newspapers go, they all do this. They all kind of live by these 10 things. So number 1, there are only 2 sides. So you have to, or only 2 ideas, excuse me. So the first thing you have to do from the get-go, if you're one of these media companies, is you have to create a binary. If it's not A, then it's B, and if it's not B, then it's A. There can be no C. There can be no D, E, or F. It's only A, B, right? Positive and negative. And depending on which side you're standing on determines what is positive and what is negative, right? Which one is A and which one is B. So if you're conservative, your A is the liberals' B, and if you're liberal, your A is the conservatives' B. And so it's you see how that works. So there can only be 2. You cannot expand beyond that. So immediately establish binary. The 2 ideas are in permanent conflict, as I just noted. If there's an A, there's a B. If there's B, there's an A. There's never similarity. It's always exact opposite. Newton's law, right? So number 1, 2 sides, binary. Number 2, those binary positions are positive and negative. They repel each other. You're not going to hate the institutions. You're going to hate the people. So if you can target an individual, you can excuse the institution that the individual is a part of. A good example of that is the target, say like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro, in terms of left-leaning ideas. You can target those guys and go after them. And you can crucify Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson. On the flip of that, if you're a Sean Hannity, you can crucify Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or a Cornel West, or, you can go after specifically individuals, but you're not going after the institution as a whole. Everything is someone else's fault. This is number 4. So you establish from the get-go that there's a binary. You establish that binary is in constant conflict with each other. Well, that naturally leads to everything that goes wrong is the binary opposite's fault. It's their fault. You have no complicit action in creating whatever has gone wrong. Your side, okay? So it's always the other's fault. So when we look at racism in America, we talk about the Democrats. largely the Democratic movement is going to say, well, most of this is the Republicans' fault. If you're a Republican, you're going to look at the Democratic institution and say, well, most of this is the Democrats' fault. In reality, it's the entire culture's fault. Because racism, systemic racism, is a very complicated subject, and it's got so many different pieces to it that you can't actually say, well, the Democrats caused that, so all of it's their fault, or the Republicans caused that, well, it's the Republicans' fault. You can't do that because it's systemic. The very term itself tells you there's no binary in systemic. Everything is part of the system. The system covers everything. So you can't point your fingers and say, well, it's this fault, that fault. You can't, and this is one of the arguments that a lot of people have been trying to counter with. Yes, there is a systemic problem in the police force. But that doesn't mean that the entire police force is bad. It's the system. So, and of course there's a binary there. But that's what Taibbi is pointing out, is that they will immediately focus in on how the other side contributed to the problem, and so it's immediately all their fault. Number 5, nothing is everyone's fault. There's got to be a binary. Okay, it kind of ties into rule number 4. Number 6, root, don't think. And what he means is you just cheer it on. Whatever your side is saying, you cheer it. You back it. You make sure that your side has the means to continue their narrative. Number 7, you cannot switch teams. And it's not, I'm a Democrat, I'm now going to be a Republican, or I'm a Republican, I'm now going to be a Democrat. It's not that simple. What he's talking about is you can't, let's say Tucker Carlson does something good. You cannot individually say, I agree with Tucker on that point. You have just now, if you're a liberal, you have just now ostracize yourself from the rest of the liberal party because you dared to agree with one thing that Tucker Carlson is all bad. He can say nothing good. You cannot agree with him. That's the mentality. On the flip side, same thing with conservatives. You cannot agree with Barack Obama. Everything he says is bad because he does not agree with us on this one thing. So he's evil. Right? We're coming to the big one here in a second. The other side is literally Hitler. And I think the line that he's got in this article is, once they're Hitler, everything is permitted. Well, that's actually the very next rule number 9. In the fight against Hitler, everything is permitted. Once you label the other side, or the person, remember the individual, once you label them Hitler, everything is off the table. You can do whatever you want. Because who's going to argue against killing Hitler? And that's the mentality, right? It's ridiculous. And then finally, number 10, feel superior. A lot of times we say, well, that's what the liberal media does. I got something for you. The right does the same thing. Look at how pompous Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, look at how pompous they are. They are very egotistical. And they present themselves as being superior intellectually, dogmatically, philosophically. So when we, it's not just the quote unquote liberal elites that show superiority. It's both sides. My idea is right and you're stupid because your idea is wrong. You did not buy into my argument, so you must be an idiot and you must be destroyed, Hitler. And that's what it comes down to. And so it's really great. And he goes into this whole explanation, a deep explanation with valid examples of each one of these quote unquote rules of hate. I want to go back to number 4. Everything is someone else's fault. And he gives this Cartesian style methodology to it. So a bad thing happens, all right? This is what he's got. So a bad thing happens. As journalists, you have to report the bad thing. So then you ask the question, can it be blamed on the other party? Okay, so let's say George Floyd. The bad thing happens. Can you blame the other party? In this instant, oh yeah. You can blame the police. Of course, the police are highly connected to the Republican Party. Boom. Got him. So the answer's yes, then we do the story. If the answer is no, we don't do the story. And what they'll do is a lot of times they will, in order to save face on credibility later if it blows up, is they will have 1 or 2 of their reporters do minor stories that mention what's going on, and then they leave it. And they don't allow it to get caught up in the cycle. But it's there. And that's why it's important to not just read the front page. You got to go and read page 6, right? You got to go deep, because that's where these smaller stories are hidden. They're publishing them so that later, if the thing blows up, they can bring it in and say, look, we've been talking about this the whole time. But the reality is they bury it because they don't want you to talk about it, because they know not that many people are going to go to page 6. In fact, most people are not going to go to page anything anymore because everything's digital. You have to go digging for these stories, which is wrong. One of the sad things, and I'm going to start wrapping it up here, one of the sad things is that they love to talk about and pat themselves on the back over the Pentagon Papers and Watergate and Murrow over McCarthy. And the press will hold those things up and say, look, we have an obligation because look at what we did in the past. Look at how we presented ourselves in the past. Look at what good we have done in the past. We are an institution of exposing. We are an institution of holding everybody accountable. But the reality is that in the last 20 years, more than that, in the last 40 years, since Watergate, and especially since the mid-90s, since the birth of Fox News, news has nothing to do with being morally objective, covering all the sides of the story, and allowing the reader to make up their own minds. It has nothing to do with that anymore. It has everything to do with polarization and maintaining that polarization. Getting you worked up in a frenzy and keeping you there. Because once they get you mad, they've got you. I did a short file on this, short file number 5, where I broke down Anderson Cooper's 360 for the night of the Rose Garden incident, where while Trump was giving a Rose Garden address, they were pushing protesters out of Lafayette Park. And what I did was I kind of broke down how Anderson Cooper did basically the 10 things on this list. I didn't even know this list existed at that moment. But he did everything. He checked it off. So, we'll end on a happy note. NBC got spanked. I think that is like hilarious. Now, don't get me wrong. Don't sit there and think that, oh, he's anti-NBC. Actually, I love NBC Nightly News. I was raised on NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw and then the Brian Williams, and now with Lester Holt. If I get a chance to watch 6:30 Nightly News, that's what I'm watching. My best friend watches ABC. He was a big Peter Jennings, part of the Peter Jennings cohort. He grew up on Jennings, and I have friends that grew up on Dan Rather. And so, and even now, if I get a chance tonight at 6:30, if I have a chance, I will probably be watching NBC Nightly News. So it hasn't really, I just think it's hilarious. And I think if you realize these guys are just shoveling shit, it's easier to dismiss the crap, so you can actually pay attention to the headline, pay attention to the story itself, because the crap gets so deep, So anyway, all right. Well, in the next one, like I said, we're going to look at, in the next part of this series, we're going to look at how national news has changed. Even local news has changed since the 1980s, since the birth of CNN, and then later the birth of Fox News in the mid-90s, and how all of that has influenced and changed the way we look at news. So we're going to look at that on the next installment of the Hate Machine BetaFiles special series on national media. The very next episode of the podcast, though, we will be talking about masculinity in episode 3. So come back for that. I did push it off from this one. I was going to do it with this episode, but then, like I said, all the stuff that happened with the Lee Fang thing and then the NBC Google debacle added on top of all the different things that have happened over the past few weeks. And it's actually started a really great conversation about national media and how they need to start self-reflecting. So we'll take, so that was exciting. So I thought, you know what, I'll do that first and then I'll do masculinity. So the very next episode that we're going to have will be on masculinity. And then we'll come back to talking about the news since the 80s in episode 4. Okay, I hope I didn't confuse the crap out of you just now, and I'm sorry if I did. Just remember, you can always catch us on YouTube at the BetaFiles. Remember to search for the BetaFiles, and you'll find us pretty quickly because we have a little emblem that has the letter beta inside of it. Just a circle with a beta. You can also look for us on the web. Our blog is thebetafiles.com. All the material that's on YouTube is also embedded on the blog, but there's also written content. And my other writers are starting to pick up, and they're starting to write stuff. So we got some variety there. Diversity in content. And then also check out our other shows. Now See This, Here, Now Then comes out on Thursdays. The Optic Poet comes out on Tuesdays. And Text Messages from the Living Room comes out on Wednesdays. BetaFiles Podcast every Wednesday and Friday, right here, wherever you're hearing this. All right. So make it a great day. I'll see you later. This has been the BetaFiles.